let's see how you can show that given premises entail a conclusion in FOL. So we said that A1 to AN entails C if and only if every interpretation on which all of A1 and AN are true is an interpretation on which C is true. So for example, the sentence "there is an X such that Fx and Gx" entails the sentence "there is an X such that Gx." And we are going to establish this fact by following a specific proof strategy. Namely, we are going to suppose that there is an interpretation I on which the first sentence is true, but the second sentence, our conclusion, is false. And then we are going to show that this supposition leads to a contradiction. Okay, so suppose that there is an interpretation I on which the premise "there is an X such that Fx and Gx is true," but the conclusion "there is an X such that Gx is false." Now, if the sentence "there is an X such that Fx and Gx is true on I," then some object A in the domain of I satisfies the open formula Fx and Gx on I, since that's what's required for the existentially quantified sentence to be true on I. Now, that means that if D is a name for A, then Fd and Gd is true on I. And given the truth conditions for conjunctions, that means that both conjuncts, Fd and Gd, are true on I, and in particular, the second conjunct, Gd, is true on I. But if Gd is true on I, and since D is a name of A, that means that A satisfies the open formula Gx on I. And so there is an object, namely the object A, that satisfies Gx on I, and that means that the existentially quantified sentence "there is an X such that Gx is true on I." So we have derived a contradiction. We have first assumed that there is an X such that Gx is false on I, and now we have shown that there is an X such that Gx must be true on I. And so that means that our initial assumption, according to which there is an interpretation on which our premise is true, but the conclusion is false, we have shown that this assumption leads to a contradiction. And that licenses us to conclude that every interpretation on which the premise is true is an interpretation on which the conclusion is true.